The way in which stories are told can vastly change what is communicated to the recipient. Perhaps the documenter wishes to exaggerate a certain point in the subject's story, or chooses to tell it in a way to suit a different audience. However, the documenter chooses what to report with a certain intention. A particular area of interest is the comparison between the insider and the outsider telling the story, especially in the common example of photographic documentation. This talk will show the complexity of the inside-outside position of the photographer in relation to their subject, where truth is associated with being on the inside and objectivity is related to being on the outside, and how this affects the representation of the subject and the story the photographer tells about them. Firstly, the binary couple inside-outside will be discussed with theory from Abigail Solomon-Godey and Susan Sontag, followed by analysis on the work done by Daria Kamisi and Marcus Priester. Lastly, an interpretation of the method implemented for Shahid al-Alam to address this dilemma. In her 1994 essay Inside Out, Abigail Solomon-Godey explores the inside-outside position of the photographer, introducing Diane Arbus as an example of an outsider. This is supported by Susan Sontag in her 1977 essay on photography, where Sontag critiques Arbus's work on deviants and marginalized people by referring to Arbus as a super-tourist, for objectifying people and lacking empathy towards her subjects. From this, it is understood that the insider position is considered good, implying a position of partaking, engagement, and privileged knowledge, and the isolated outsider position is considered bad, due to an alienated distance between the photographer and subject. This is affirmed by Martha Rosler, a writer and artist who documented the essay In, Around, and Afterthoughts on documentary photography. He views outsider photography as victim photography and suggests self-representation as an alternative, empowering the subject and promoting equality. Binary couple inside-outside can be seen as a central theme to the issue of photographic documentation, spanning from Sontag contrasting empathy and disconnection with the subject, to Rosler highlighting issues from a Marxist perspective of authority, subjugation, and equality. Despite this fact, the photojournalist, the super-tourist, the documentary photographer, etc., still commits an act of violence by taking something from the subject, only seeing a partial and distorted view of the subject to be represented, listening and recording only what they find engaging. Daria Kamisi is a photographer born and brought up in Beirut, covers socio-political stories from across the region. Kamisi's work on missing focuses on 17,000 people who went missing during 1975 to 1990 in the Libyan Civil War. In a 2013 interview for Phone Line, Kamisi recalls an occasion when a busload of people drove past with cameras, taking photographs while she stood outside with one of her subjects listening to her story. Indeed, this morbidly voyeuristic action is an illustration of photographers being on the outside, due to the disregard of their subject and lack of compassionate involvement, comparable to Arbus's work mentioned earlier. In contrast to Arbus, Kamisi is an example of work forged by an insider, which Solomon-Godey refers to as the confessional note. Furthermore, in her photographs you can see that the camera does not distance her from her subject, but paradoxically almost creates clarity and compassion, letting the viewer know that her work and photographs are purely for her subject, putting them before herself. The photographs within her subject's home show how close Kamisi came to the subject with her camera, triggering the viewer to assume an intimate relationship between the photographer and the subject. Roland Barthes summed up this analgesic effect of looking at images of despair in his 1979 book, The Eiffel Tower and Other Mythologies, when he wrote, "Someone has shuddered for us, reflected for us, and judged for us. The photographer has left us nothing, except a simple right of intellectual acquiescence." Put in another way, one looks at the events and photographs of tragedy and feels relieved they are not happening anywhere nearby. Kamisi's work does not give a voyeuristic impression. With her photograph, she tells stories of the people she relates to, both being in situations she has had or has heard of. Being born and raised in Beirut distinguishes her from the other outside photographers due to her innate connection with the people and the land, giving her access to these opportunities. Though Kamisi's work is incredibly intimate, it's still only Kamisi's version of the authentic story. The viewer will never be able to understand or experience the reality in exactly the same way Kamisi's subject had, and neither will the photographer, due to everyone's unique perceptions and approaches in life. Similar to Kamisi, Marcus Bleasdale is a photographer who has shown compassion for a subject through his photographic work, but has also done so in his actions outside of photography. Bleasdale set up an orphanage in eastern Congo with a group of journalists to help solve the crisis there, which now looks after 97 children. These actions place Bleasdale in a complex position when it comes to using the inside-outside dualism. Bleasdale is a white Western photojournalist and would regularly be considered as an outsider in the regions he works in. However, his work has the intimacy of an insider and lacks the clinicality that one would expect from an outsider. Bleasdale was among the few journalists covering the ongoing conflict in the Central African Republic during 2013 to 2014, documenting the Violence for Human Rights Watch. In his 2002 publication, 100 Years of Darkness, he covered the conflict within the Democratic Republic of Congo since 1998. These works have given him recognition for influencing policymakers around the world. It is clear in Bleasdale's work and commentaries that he has a substantial amount of understanding and involvement in the situations he documents, and consideration for the people represented in his work. In the 2013 interview with photographer Jonathan Well, Bleasdale states that the image is one part of it. Understanding the environment, the people, and the concept is far more important. From this, it is observed that photography can be deeper than a single image, and the concept of narrative is used, almost countering Henry Cartier-Bresson's famous decisive moment. This relates to Kamisi's recollection of the reactive photographers mentioned earlier. The photographs produced from the drive-by shootings, in Kamisi's memory, reflect the depth Bleasdale speaks of due to being nothing more than photographs shot at a decisive moment, with no connection or understanding to what is inside the photographic image. Bleasdale's understanding of photographic documentation resonates with Robert Capa's axiom: if your photos aren't good enough, you're not close enough, which is transformed during a 2007 talk in New York by practitioner Todd Papageorge to if your photos aren't good enough, you're not reading enough. This more recent version addresses the necessity of every photographer to understand that they are photographing, to become familiar with the context and subject. The only knowledge we have of events are those that someone else has narrated to us, which is important to consider when the role of storytellism is taken on. Context can be found in different forms. Typically, it is through extensive research. However, it can also be achieved through living experience, which come together to enlighten the choices photographers make. Context is a defining factor in making an image. In a 2010 talk for FOMO, David Campbell outlined its importance by stating that the work that sustains itself over time is the work that understands its own context. However, like Kamisi, Bleasdale's work is only his version of the true story, a copy carved into paper through writing an image. Yet Bleasdale is different in that he is situated in a complex precision between outsider and insider, an unplotted relationship between him and his subjects. This raises the point that perhaps Solomon Godley's binarism of insider-outsider is not just a duality, but could be better be described as a scale, inside on one end and outside on the other. Judgment of where on the scale of photographer lives would be made through the amount of engagement, involvement, compassion, etc., which is undertaken in the stories of the people the photographer represents. This also highlights that no one can truly become an absolute insider to someone else's story apart from the original storyteller. When photographers document someone else's story, the true and undistorted version of that narrative remains with the original storyteller. In other words, only the creator of the story who has experienced and lived through it can be the absolute insider to it. Others can empathize, but will never feel it in the same way the original storyteller has, as it has been created through their unique experiences, emotions, and perspectives. However, powerful stories have a need to be shared, and the original storyteller may not have the skills and/or resources to disseminate their stories around the globe, which is why photographers and journalists undertake the role of storyteller in order to relay their stories for them, some doing it well and some not. Shahid al-Alam is a storyteller and photographer from Bangladesh who, in his own way, understood the impossibility of becoming an absolute insider to someone else's story. In a 2013 talk for Phone, Alam states that photographs taken at the time by visiting photography, usually white-person photographers, came up with a certain type of imagery when speaking about Bangladesh. He blames them for his distortion of information, capturing only famine, poverty, and hardship. However, Alam, even as a Bangladeshi photographer, was still a middle-class male and recognized this as being a barrier between himself and other people. For instance, while he would take photographs of, say, a woman in a slum in Bangladesh, the distance between them was similar to the distance between the subject and the foreign photographer, both being outsiders and being in positions of authority over the woman, leaving her subjective. Alam wanted to give these people the opportunity to represent themselves and to be able to tell their own stories in the hopes of super tourism and to prevent the distorted and decontextualized reproduction of the original storyteller's narrative. Susan Sontag warns against decontextualization in her 2003 book Rebellion, Pain of Others, in which she describes how during the Balkan Wars the same photographs of children being killed in the shelling of a village were passed around at both Serbian and Croatian propaganda briefings. The Royal Visual Journalism Network and DRIP were created by Alam, empowering the rural people of Bangladesh to tell their own story and to combat the interests of mainstream media and their dress perception of the majority of the people. RJVN started with Alam teaching rural people how to use recording devices to tell and record their own stories, allowing an absolute insider's perspective. The stories would then be sent over to RVJN to be disseminated without intervention or manipulation to the stories. To recapitulate, the first point to note is the notion that the insider-outsider position, the photographer, that is being investigated is more complex than just a duality. It should instead be seen as a scale with inside and outside in both extremes. Secondly, due to people's unique perceptions, perspectives, and experiences in life, the only absolute insider to the story would be the creator. Once the story gets passed on, going through its first iteration, it only becomes a version of the original, and will be different, even if similar. Humans are unique, therefore it is logical to consider that their stories would also be unique. Thirdly, a photographer attempting to relay the storyteller's narrative through their own photography in the way that the person they are representing would is attempting the impossible. Without doubt, Alam's method of allowing the original storyteller to speak their story solves this dilemma of getting the undistorted story of the absolute insider out to the world. However, systems like this need to be implemented around the globe for it to make a material impact. Ultimately, as photographers and storytellers, it is important to recognize the power of the camera. The ethics in which we can distort an image should be questioned, considering how the viewers can have their prejudices persuaded and how the subjects are affected, the kind of disservice they can be subjected to through the images produced and the actions both taken and not taken on films. Thank you.
sensibilities should be portrayed in the final perceived narrative?
Can you say again, please?
In your opinion, how much of the photographer's sensibilities should be portrayed in the final perceived narrative?
Sensibility.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that?
So how much does the photographer have a say on the overall?
Well, it depends on what their context is, on what they're documenting and what they're photographing. So if obviously they're trying to document someone else's story, it should be about them, it should be more collaboration and just the photographer being there, snapping and going. They need to understand the context of what they're photographing. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that the photographer shouldn't really have a say at all. He should only be as much of a viewer as his audience would be. He should just be there to get the story as truthfully as possible.
It's very about there being a scale between inside and outside. And I was just wondering why you thought, and you spoke about Marcus Pisa being both. I just wondered why you thought he was on that scale.
Well, I guess he'd be leaning more to the inside. Again, the only absolute insider to the stories that Marcus Pisa would document would be the actual people in his photographs. Those people would be on the extreme insider, whereas Marcus would come close, but he'd still be an insider, but he wouldn't be an absolute insider.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you think perhaps the subject can manipulate the way they're being represented? Because we talked about the idea of constructed identity and self-portraiture. So do you think that even having an insider status, the representation couldn't actually be true because the subject has fabricated it?
Yes. Yes, and I guess there'd be no other photographer knowing unless he had lie detecting powers.
Any other questions?